Massachusetts number plates out there, so you guys will be in 2 weeks quarantine on the way home, I trust. You know, they picked somebody up at the Boston Common the other week. He was selling life extension potions. And when they run him through the system, it turns out that he had been locked up for the exact same thing, 1987, 1919, and 1863. Okay. You're not quite awake yet. Have more coffee. So, this presentation is about, how was it and what happened to the Christian church while the Third Reich was unfolding and in progress. And we're going to visit a couple of topics here. And a big chunk of this is to make sure that you get a good understanding of what it is to live under a real totalitarian regime, because I think one of the experiences that Americans lack is the historical knowledge of what this is like. It has never happened here. It has happened in other places, to be sure, but there is no, if you will, tribal memory of this sort the way it is in Europe, where the old people, and some are still alive, have personally been through this, and they can tell stories that you guys will never hear. So that's a big thing that was important to me, because it really is the backdrop of everything that I'm going to talk about. And to further bolster this, I gave you some material here that is mostly background material. There are 2 publications from journals at the time. One is somebody analyzing, the situation in Germany, and that is the first paper. It's written by somebody called Otto of Austria, and I have not been able to find out if that is the real Otto from Austria or this is some sort of a pseudonym. The second one is a pseudonym, Epaphroditus, from somebody who emigrated Germany. This is a member of the Confessing Church. He probably emigrated to England and then wrote this article. And if nothing else, you'll get a good sense of the mental and spiritual desperation that there was around those times, just to figure the hell out what was going on. So read this at your leisure when you get back home, or don't, as the case may be. So, first thing to look at, could it possibly be that Hitler was a Christian? Let's see, what did he say about this? So here's a line from the political program of the National Socialist Party as early as 1920. We demand freedom of religion, I'm over here, for all religious denominations within the state. Now it comes, so long as they do not endanger the existence or oppose the moral senses of the Germanic race. Well, who decides that? Okay, but reads good, doesn't it? Then April 22, my feeling as a Christian points me to my Lord and Savior as a fighter. Hitler is Catholic by upbringing, so he continues, and if there is anything which could demonstrate that we're acting rightly, it is the distress that daily grows. For as a Christian, I have also a duty to my own people. And this is in Munich. This is in close proximity to the coup d'etat they did with the Bavarian government. This is 11 years before anything big happens in Germany. These guys take over the Bavarian government, the coup fails, Hitler goes to jail, and in jail he writes Mein Kampf. 1925, I think he is out by that time, and this is a line from Mein Kampf. Eternal nature takes revenge for violation of her commandments. I believe I am acting today in the spirit of the Almighty Creator. By standing guard against the Jew, I'm defending the work of the Lord. Well, if that isn't a Christian, I don't know what this looks like, right? Question mark? Okay. 1933, he is chancellor at this point, speaking in the parliament. the national government will regard it as its first and foremost duty to revive in the nation the spirit of unity and cooperation. I will preserve and defend those basic principles on which our nation has been built. It regards Christianity as the foundation of our national morality and the family as the basis of national life. So, based on this, he goes on a month later, right in front of the parliament: the government of the Reich that regards Christianity as the unshakable foundation of the morals and moral code of the nation attach the greatest value to friendly relations with the Holy See and endeavoring to develop them. Well, that was a political speech. There was a Christian central party in the parliament whose votes he needed, and after this they decided to vote for the Empowerment Act that was legislated a couple of weeks after this, because they thought this is a man that is standing up for Christianity, right? And from the statements, would you disagree? Hey, don't let me hang here. Yes? No? Are you persuaded? You're not.
There's no action, just words.
Yeah. So, may God Almighty give our work His blessing, strengthen our purpose, and endow us with wisdom and the trust of our people, for we are fighting not for ourselves, but for Germany. And this is, the same speech a little further down. Long story short, then, could he be a Christian? Is this somehow friendly statements, friendly leaning to the Christian churches? And the answer is yes. If you take those words just for what they are written, you have to arrive at the conclusion that this is actually somebody who is driven by a Christian spirit. Maybe not your flavor, maybe not your persuasion or franchise, but clearly not somebody who's an anti-Christian person, right? So those are the early days, right? This is 1933. Hitler came to power in March that year with the Empowerment Act. You've heard the other presentation, I hope. If not, go look it up online. And he is now, in March 33, Nazi is firmly in power with a license to essentially do what they want. So let's do just the smallest fig leaf of a historical backdrop here. So in January 33, very naturally, as the head of the largest party in the parliament, he gets picked to form the government and he becomes chancellor. There's no coup d'etat, there's nothing wrong with this. This was just normal behavior. A couple of weeks later, the Empowerment Act enables Nazi, with Hitler as chancellor, to essentially do as they please. That also wasn't that unusual, because for the last 10 years or so, the Weimar Republic had been ruled by decree, because the parliament was so fractured that they couldn't agree on the time of day. And there's business that government needs to do, and in order to get this done, they had legislation in place where basically the chancellor could decree certain things. It's very much like the orders that come directly from the president here in the US, same idea. In case of emergency, there got to be a mechanism that rules, right? And the president of the republic, which is a different office in the European tradition than it is here, has to agree with those decrees. So there is a minimum, check and balances, but the idea is really that there is a pretty straightforward mechanism to get the most necessary things done, regardless of what the parliament says, right? And the Weimar Republic was ruled exclusively by this mechanism because they had absolutely no basis for any bigger things for the last couple of years. So nothing wrong with that, but Nazi then goes ahead and abuses this big time. By July, all the non-Nazi parties have been made illegal. A lot of their representatives are in jail or have been otherwise taken out of circulation. And the parliament essentially dissolved itself at this point, and Nazi is on the way to transform Germany into a totalitarian state. Well, two questions then arise. What exactly is a totalitarian state? and where in totalitarianism is room for the church. So let's look at those two. What is totalitarianism? It's an ideology that by definition includes all aspects of people's lives, right? Totalitarianism comes from total, and it means it's a total lifestyle viewpoint. It's an exclusive life philosophy. Anyone needs to understand who they are. That gives you everything you need to understand who you are, where you came from, what is expected of you, and where this whole nation is going. It's called a Weltanschauung. This is a German term that has no equivalent one-word translation. It literally means the perspective under which to look at and understand what's going on around you. So it's a view of life, if you will. And totalitarianism, and certainly the Nazi ideology, understood itself to be one of these things. It's a way to look at the rest of the world and to measure and triangulate what things mean and how to go about stuff. So, like many cults and extreme religion, such a teaching will not tolerate any other teachings that thrive to have explanatory power about the world. So, claiming to explain the past, present, and future, the adherents of such an ideology, they just know why stuff happened in the past. They know all the reasons, and they know where this is going, and they're deeply convinced that this is the only way it could possibly develop. And when you have such a viewpoint and then things do not come to pass the way they were predicted, it got to be because somebody interfered with this, right? Somebody screwed this up and prevented it from unfolding the way it was meant to be. And when that happens, you of course have no trouble finding the deceivers and the deviators, and the enemies of the people usually abound in short order, and they need to be gone after because they're preventing history from unfolding the way it was meant to unfold. And that is how this goes. Everybody is suspected to be treasonous unless proven otherwise. So in other words, you have to kiss the ring daily, otherwise you're in danger, right? Because you may have changed your mind overnight, and then suddenly you are working against us. Totalitarianism also claims to be logically complete, meaning there is no need for any other mechanism of explanation, right? If somehow the explanation is not found within the ideology, you haven't been paying attention, right? It's not because it's not there. And that includes not only the material needs of people, but also their spiritual needs. And here we're kind of swinging around to where does the church go in this? Well, there is the other side of this total claim on people's life and thinking is that this ideology demands complete adherence to it, complete obedience. There cannot be any people who have their own mind or they disagree with parts of it or anything of the sort, right? You're either in it and then you buy this hook, line, and sinker, or you aren't. And if you aren't, then you're pretty close to being an enemy of the people on the spot, right? There's no gray shades. As a consequence then, any totalitarianism has to be collectivist, right? All of life's needs are provided by the state, and that is precisely what a collectivist society looks like. So then, it means that the subject, that is the former citizens, completely belong to the state and to the party that runs the show. She or he belongs to them body and soul in all their possible expressions of life and death. So whatever you do as a person gets redefined in the context of this ideology. You're either helping this along or you're obstructing it, right? And the state, as the owner of the individual, may modify the rights, or as the case may be, take them away, at any moment at liberty, and there is no recourse if that happens. So the state will therefore not tolerate and indeed actively dismantle any alternative explanations of reality. And unless such institutions like church derive their power from the state and are tolerated, that includes the church. So ultimately, in totalitarianism, there is exactly one authority, and that's the guy at the very top, right? And this gets implemented by something called the leader principle, and we'll look at that in a moment. But the authority from the top basically gives everybody else license to be there and to do whatever they're doing, right? And without such license, you have no place in such an organization. So the leadership principle then is something that means the Führer is always right, the leader is always right, and this cannot be questioned. He's only answerable to God and to himself, so in other words, there is no other reference than what he says, and his word is above all the written law. If he hints, that certain things are in a bad state, for his followers, this is the order to go and fix it. Right? And it doesn't require a law, it doesn't require a decision of any kind, right? The Führer being unhappy about something is the command to go fix it, right? And you can see where this leads. Everything is basically hinging on this person, and they hang on every word from his lips, and it's usually a his, right? And his orders are to be obeyed unquestioning. If that means you perish executing the order, then that is part of the deal. And all the offices and the decisions are basically implemented by the rest of the institutions of such a state, right? Whether that is the police, the military, the courts, the economy, their job is to implement whatever the Führer wants. So what's that look like in practice? This principle that the top person is always right and cannot be questioned is implemented in every organization. So you have basically hierarchies of little Führers, right, of little leaders. And within their own realm, they have absolute responsibility of what they do, right? And they demand absolute obedience from their subjects in return. So you can see how the principle that runs the state is basically rendered in some minimized or adapted form into every organization, every sports club, everything you can imagine has this structure. Outside their realm, this Führer only answers to his Führer. And you can see how in such a structure, with no questioning the other way, stuff gets decreed from the top, and without any checks and balances gets implemented down to the last link of this chain, right? No questions asked. If you disagree, you're out. So how did Nazi implement this principle? All the schools, the clubs like sports clubs, civil institutions and authorities, city government, state government, all of those were subjected to this leader principle. So the current elected leaders were substituted. In many cases, the currently elected leader got reappointed, but now he's serving by the grace of this upper leader. He is not serving because people elected him, right? It's the same dude, he's doing the same job, but his legitimacy is now hanging off of kissing the ring of the Führer every day, right? And the moment he somehow crosses the Führer, he's out. And he can be as incompetent as a doornail. As long as he toes the corporate line, he's got a job. And if he somehow makes that doubtful, he's out in a heartbeat, and some ideologue replaces him regardless of whether they have any domain knowledge or are even qualified for the job. The only thing that's important is that they do not question the Führer. Right? And then, on the way down, they implement the same principles. So, for example, corporations were allowed to retain their hierarchies, but they converted to this Führer principle on the inside. So, in other words, suddenly the CEO is the absolute commander of whatever the management structure is there is. Yes, they're still producing stuff. The company is still in private hands, but they get their instructions from the government, what to make, how much of it, and what the price is, right? So this is the one instance where you essentially get state ownership and state control, and the productive means, like companies and other resources economically, are still in private hands. This is a method that has fallen into forgetfulness. People do not remember, but that is how this worked, right?
Hey, Mick,
Yes.
what about the press and the communications, news industry?
Yeah, same deal. Same deal. It's everything, right? I should have mentioned the media.
Were they independent or were they part of the?
No, they got sucked up into this, right? If you run the city newspaper and you are reporting critically, you get picked up by the secret police and somebody else runs your newspaper. You still own it, you still get the profits, but you don't get to decide what's printed, right? Good question. I should, yeah. So, what happens to those who resist or disagree with the Führers, question the Führer's judgment? You're fired, right? No, not throat slit. They just get fired, right? They get excluded from any meaningful role in the public. If they have the private means to get by, fine. If not, they're out of a job and they're out of a living, essentially, right? And those were the early stages. So it's a bit more differentiated than just being picked up and killed. It's not that easy. There are actually plenty of people who lived through this entire time in some situation where they got ousted from a legitimate place in the society, and they had a marginal existence for 10 years because they couldn't get back in, right? So where does that leave Christianity? What do you think? On a collision course, right? Wholesale, no if, buts, and maybes. If the state or the party claims total domination over a man's body and soul, then of course any religion that claims to have control over people's soul, or any business in where the soul goes, is completely at odds with this ideology. It's not difficult to see. So the Nazi understood this from day one. The churches in Germany, and you have to imagine Germany in the late 20s or 30s to be just as thriving in church life as the US is today, right? There's no reason to smell a rat or suspect anything bad. You go to church, you have your denominations, the whole program, right? That suddenly there is no room for this anymore in whatever the government is that is coming up. That's a tough one to find out from the inside, right? Because it's a complete break with what you've done for the last generation or 2 or 5, right? So here are some Nazi statements, and they were quite open. Unfortunately, they were quite open very late in the game, right? Those are statements from 5, 7, 10 years later. It is said that the body belongs to the state and the soul to the church or God. This is no longer the case. The whole man, body and soul belongs to the German nation and the German state. The latter has also taken all matters of faith under its own control. This is 1938. The Nazis have been in power for 5 years by that time, right? And you can see very clearly they had no illusions as to where they stood on this. And they had identified church, regardless of denomination, as enemy that needed to be dealt with. Here's another one from the leader of the Labor Front, which is the big unified dispenser of workforce in the Nazi economy. The party claims the totality of the soul of German people. It cannot and will not suffer that any other party or party doctrine should dominate in Germany. Upon admission to the National Socialist order of leaders, the man belongs to the party, body and soul. The party gives him everything if he in return gives all that he has to the party. Again, this is 1938, right? So churches then derive their authority from God, not from any government. That is part of what church is. And they're in no position, if you're a Christian, you're in no position to accept this leadership principle in matters of church and to a lesser extent in other matters of society, right? Why is somebody the head of state? Oh, they've been put there by God. Well, then, why do I have to follow every word when God says something else? And you can see how quickly you run into trouble there with your beliefs if you have a system like this. So biblically it says, and do not be called leaders, for only one is your leader, and that is Christ. That's a less known quote. The better known one is, we must obey God rather than man, or more than man, depending on the translation that you use. And that is usually what is quoted to say that Christianity cannot just sit there and do whatever government wants. Right? There got to be a moment of pause where you consider what God's position is on this and what we know about that, and then you decide. So the Protestant churches for a long time did absolutely not understand this, right? And that is something that was aggravated by the situation that you had in the early 30s, that the control of the state to every aspect of life, this totalitarian aspect, really prevented people from having too much time to think, because a lot of your wake time was picked up and taken up by mandatory activities from either state or party or from work. But if you were youth, for example, you had mandatory after-school activity, and even if you were, in a situation that you could think about this, there wasn't really too much free time for you to pursue this. So how then do you kill a church, right? If you put yourself into the Nazi position, how do you go about, eradicating Christianity? Well, there are two methods. Method one is you go after the physical body of the church. You confiscate their resources, you detain their priests, you interrupt the education of new clergy by closing down the seminaries, you intimidate the parishioners to press them to leave the church physically so that you kind of empty the sanctuaries, if you will, and you prevent youth from ever hearing the word of God. And Nazi did all this. Churches were closed by the hundreds, literally, under any pretense you want. A popular one was, oh, you're in danger of an air raid and your church is not offering air shelter. And the argument that you were far away from the reach of any bombers at the time, like in Austria, where never any bomb fell because the bombers from Britain couldn't get there, right? That didn't matter. You did not have the air raid shelter, and therefore you got shut down on building code. Okay? And there's reports from Catholics, we'll get to them late in our presentation here. In the ecclesiastical province of Cologne, remember the big cathedral, right? This is an old place. 47 convents fell victim to the onset of confiscation last summer alone. And this is like 39, 38-ish, right? When the German troops entered the city of Posen in Poland today, it had 30 public churches. Today there remain 3 in which divine worship is held. The rest have been converted to use as warehouses, riding school, and the like. In the whole diocese of Posen, only 45 of 431 churches are still operational. So 90% of the churches were closed, right? Where do the parishioners go? Nobody knows. They're on their own, right? And that is another concept of these totalitarian regimes, that they atomize people, right? Any congregation, any aggregation of people that is not sanctioned by the state gets dispersed. So coordinating anything is very difficult suddenly, right? And by the way, this is a statement from the piece of literature that I gave you from this Otto of Austria business. You'll find that in there, and he has plenty more of that. Unified Nazi school supplants all types of denominational schools, be they Catholic or Protestant. So you run a little school on the side here, state comes in and closes the place, right? We now have a state school, and that's the only game in town, and your pupils will go there, period. And that happened rather swiftly. You may remember that Austria got annexed in March 38. Within 5.5 months, all the parochial schools were closed. And to think that the curriculum in these schools was somehow neutral to Christianity is a big mistake. They were indoctrination places. You heard the Führer is always right, you will follow the Führer and not ask any stupid questions. And on it goes. Right? And there is absolutely no room for coming back and having second thoughts. So compare that to the curriculum in a parochial or denominational school, right? Where God is here for us all. Salvation is free, right? And state serves at the behest of God to implement his kingdom in this fallen world. Totally different message, right? So they taught the topic of racial concepts and racial superiority of the German race and the whole ball of wax there, and the Jews are all bad and all this. And that is what supplants the curriculum from a denominational school. And if you think this as a nationwide exercise, well, that's quite a rug to pull under the church idea of how to educate young people, right? Very easy to see that this has big consequences. So beyond the school, then, you have organizations like the Hitler Youth, which had mandatory membership from a certain age forward, and they monopolized the free time that young people had by having all kinds of activities. And those were fun and interesting activities. So the young kids, they wanted to go to the Hitler Youth, right? Yeah, the trouble is that you could not really be a church member and be in the Hitler Youth. Right, so here you have these kids that get to fly drones and airplanes and all the fun activities that you could possibly want as a kid. Yeah, but you can't be there because your parents are members of a church. Too bad for you, right? So they take very deliberately the kids in on Sunday mornings to prevent them from attending services. And so on and so forth. You get the idea. Higher institutions, if they were set up under Christian spirit, like a Catholic university, and there were quite a few of them in Europe, they had closed down wholesale within weeks of the arrival of the new system. And also the priest seminary get closed down. The Protestants in Austria, within a couple of weeks of German takeover, had none, and the Catholics had one left. So there you have it. According to the German law, every young man who wishes later to get a higher position as a state or party official or as an economic leader can be selected only if he has first served for a while in the Ordensburg. Ordensburg was a camp for young people who had leadership aspirations, and of course this was the maximum indoctrination, and to sound out the young people and see how firmly they stood on the ground of the ideology. Can they be trusted from the viewpoint of the party, right? But to be admitted to an Ordensburg, there is a condition that every person must first have left the church of which he was a member. And you can see how anybody, after a while, who has anything to say or to decide in any organization of any standing is a person that has left behind church and Christianity, right? They get weeded out with mechanisms like this one. So there are two ways to leave a church. One way is you act. You leave the church and that's your decision. The other way to do this is the church leaves you. And that is by redefining what church is. So this is a lot tougher to find out because you personally have not changed. you're still thinking the exact same way about church and Christianity you did before. It's just that your church is someplace else. Very tough, very confusing. Took them ages to figure this one out, and it's still a problem today when that happens in congregations that say change denominations or stuff, right? There's a whole lot of very confused people that are left behind. So, method 2 is to attack the soul of the church. And number 1 there is that you somehow put a halo on your leader, right? You make him a saint or a prophet or a guy sent from heaven to implement God's stuff. And that sounds like something you heard on the news lately. That is precisely what it is, right? You somehow put this into a Christian mantle and you give them license to be a messenger from God. And then you redefine what church belief means. You redefine what the church's job is within the ideology of the system. You redefine key terminology. You claim that Martin Luther is on your side. That works very well with Protestants. You rewrite the Bible and the key documents of your Christian spirit, and you colonize the existing church with some groups that basically take this message and implement it. So let's look at this in order. And suffice it to say that few saw this coming in the church because it's very difficult. So just a little background on Protestantism. By 1933, when the Nazi gained power, 95% of the Germans were Christian, 2/3 in the Protestant Church and 1/3 in the Catholic Church, and the rest is some small denominations that were all over the place, just like it is here. The largest church was the German Evangelical Church, and I put a note in here, evangelical does not have the fundamentalist overtones in Europe, or indeed anywhere outside the US that it does here, right? They call themselves the Evangelische Kirche. The Evangelical Church is the literal translation, but I think it's best if you think of this as the German Protestant Church, because it goes across the spectrum of the Protestants, right? It's not just the Lutherans, it's the Reformed, it's the United, the whole spectrum, right? But it's not evangelical in the sense that the word is used here in America. And I wanted to make that crystal clear. So they are organized regionally into 28 different provinces. Some of this goes back to 500 years earlier, and it's just the way the borders fell after a big war about confessions. And it absolutely contains any gray shade that you want in the blends of Lutheranism, Reformed churches, and Union churches, right? Which is Reformed and Lutheran. This is a special German thing that got instigated late in the 19th century, and among other things, the Missouri Synod was founded by people who ran away from this unionization effort, because that was something the state pushed, and there were plenty of people who said, we're having none of this, and they packed up their stuff and walked over here, starting the Missouri Synod in 1860-ish, if memory serves. So Protestantism is, like it used to be and still is, splintered in many factions, right? And you have the Lutherans, the Reformed, and the United. And within that comes a group called the German Christians, who began as a cross-denominational splinter group along the ideological lines of the Nazis. They preached a Christianity based on race, meaning, you know, the white race and the German race, the Aryan race, is superior to all others, and by the way, God is on their side, right? But even beyond that, many actually welcomed this early Nazism. It wasn't as uniformly opposed as you would think it was. There were a whole lot of people who thought, you know, after the humiliation of losing the First World War, after the economic crisis of '29 and the hyperinflation and all this stuff that had wounded the pride of the German people, now comes a group that kind of reinstates Germans to the right place in life, right? And that is a very seductive proposition, and the Germans fell for this, including many of the Christians. And for them, a yes to Jesus Christ did not come with a no to Adolf Hitler and his gang, right? So you have these people who are sitting in the middle and think, honest to goodness, that these two things can go together, right? And the Protestant Church at the time was full of folks that had this viewpoint rather than a clear opposition to Nazism. And that, of course, contributes to the confusion. So who are those German Christians? They started in the 20s as a group of activists, and they were formally institutionalized in 31. And by then, the Nazi Party is already very large in Germany. They have not quite the largest faction in the parliament, but they are the second largest, or something along those lines. They had millions of votes, so this is no longer a fringe movement, is what I'm trying to say in 31. And the Nazis used that to really plant a seed inside the Protestant Church. And how did this go, and what does this mean? This is Alfred Rosenberg. He is Hitler's appointed ideologist about the Nazi ideology and how to implement this. And he wrote a book in 33, and here's a line from this book. Today a new faith is awakening, the myth of legend and legend of the blood, the belief that it is by blood that the divine nature of man is to be manifested, the belief that Nordic blood represents that mystery which has replaced and overcome the ancient sacraments. Now that's nothing but a wholesale abandonment of everything that Christianity stands for, right? The Catholics understood this. This book went on the index 2 weeks after it was published, right? The Protestants still didn't see it. So the German Christians are led by Ludwig Müller, a totally incompetent leader, but he was towing the corporate line, and that is why he got the job. They enjoyed a large support among general parishioners, and in July 33, there is a church election where basically you elect the church leaders for the different counties, and they all together elect the leader for Germany as a whole. And 7 out of 10 parishioners, 70%, vote for the German Christian representatives. And that gives you an idea of how big the support was that this ran, right? Not a fringe group. No, they're the majority in your congregation. They like what they see from the government, and they want to be a part of this, right? Ouch. Right? After this book from Mr. Rosenberg, they should have been up in arms. Nothing of the sort happened. So within days then, and unsurprisingly, the state recognizes this new church, now under the leadership of the German Christians. Any dissent is silenced by basically expulsion of the members that disagree, right? Suddenly you're no longer a member of your church because you spoke up inappropriately against the ideology. You're gone, don't come back next Sunday. And also by violence and intimidation. You know, you have a group of your fellow parishioners or other thugs show up at your home and say, look, if you don't change your mind, we'll hurt you, okay? So pressure then forms on the Protestant churches to conform to the leadership principle and also to expel Jewish Christians from ordained ministry. So in Germany at the time there were quite a few people who had converted from the Jewish faith through baptism to become Christians. And many of them had become pastors. And they were employed like regular Lutheran pastors would be employed. Same happened on the Catholic side. And now the pressure is mounting because of their Jewish blood and origin to expel them from the clergy. And sure enough, it didn't long for that to actually go through, and they were technically defrocked and fired from their positions. There's a lot of detail there, and that is how it started. Claiming that Luther is on your side. Well, Luther's 405th birthday happened to be in the year 1993, and of course that was a juicy target for the Nazi to go and milk to the last drop, and they did. So here's a poster. The text reads, "Hitler's fight and Luther's teaching both defend the German peoples well," something that rhymes in German and is not translatable this way. There's a big church in Berlin, the Memorial Church. If you ever go to Berlin, see it. The ruins are still there. They have been converted back to a church, but part of the steeple is missing because it got bombed down at some point. So between 1933 and 35, right when this Nazi business is on the rise, this church is being built. And the interior of the church very deliberately blends states symbols with Christian symbols. So here is a scene from the pulpit, and you can see there is a soldier wearing a steel helmet here, right? And if you closely look at this Jesus, he's a muscular, Aryan-looking dude, right? He will fight for the German race and get them what they are owed, right? You also have a Hitler likeness on the baptismal font, cap in hand. So very clearly and very deliberately, Christianity was infused with the symbolism that came out of the Nazi ideology. Here are some images from the triumphal arch in that church. After the war, the swastikas had been scraped out of the tiles, but they were there, and you can see here on this side, this is actually the state eagle with the Nazi swastika underneath. That is a state symbol. That has no place in a church, right? How did it get there? Well, you know now, right? Very deliberately. Well, Nazi usurped Luther, particularly for his anti-Semitic writings, and that is a very sad chapter of Luther's life. He absolutely did do anti-Semitic writings, but by the time Nazi comes around in 1930-ish or so, most of those anti-Jewish books and publications of Luther have been not in circulation for centuries, literally, because the church recognized his error and his obsession with the Jews not wanting to be baptized. And they had just not reprinted these things. And we have people on record from the Nazi hierarchy who, smirkingly thump through a publication of Luther's works and say, well, isn't that a coincidence that, the most anti-Jewish writings of this Luther guy are not in this book, right? So let's go republish, right? And that's what they did, and they harped on this big time, right? And Luther, late in his life, was very angry with the Jews because they refused to take on his newfound insights. And if you read those pamphlets, they're really bad, right? He's asking for their houses to be burnt down and, they being killed and whatnot. So you can see how that serves the Nazi ideology really well, and that is precisely what they harped on this. Unlike the Nazi, however, Jewishness for Luther wasn't on racial terms. You could fix your Jewishness, if you excuse my language here, simply by being baptized. End of story, right? And of course, if you define this on racial terms, there's no way you can get out from under being born Jewish, right? This is with you, and there is absolutely no cure for this if you want to use that language. But for Luther, that was different. Let's leave it there. Let it suffice to say that the Lutheran churches here in the U.S. Felt it necessary to publish a publication, I think in the 60s, to distance themselves from this aspect of Luther as a mistake, right? They did not want to be held against this. So Nazi then milked this Luther business to the last drop, of course, and it was ultimately the defrocking from the Aryan paragraphs in the church constitutions that finally got some organized resistance from the Protestant church. Here's Martin Niemöller, whom you have heard of, I suppose. He's the guy who formed the Pastors Emergency League because suddenly you have unemployed pastors and they have nothing to go on, right? There's no unemployment insurance if you got fired on ideological grounds, right? Of course not. What were you thinking, right? So the churches then, at least of all, the Protestant church did not see it coming. So last thing to do is redefine key terminology. Here's another quote from Rosenberg's book, and again, this is in the text that I gave you. In his book, Rosenberg talks of the German race as the ultimate source of inspiration, as the fountainhead of all values. All created value has been produced by the German race. As opposed to all revealed religions, the defense of the godlike German man reposes in a new religion, the religion of blood and soil. The God of this new religion is not a personal deity, but is identified with the universe. Equality of man before God does not exist. The leaders of the Nordic race constitute the clergy of that new religion. At the same time, they form the state. Infallibility belongs to them. Redemption is not the salvation from sin, but the salvation from inferiority. Now that is a complete redefinition of the whole set of constructions that underlie Christianity. And you can see how this was very deliberately undertaken. The thing concludes to say, the Führer is a Messiah who liberates those of Nordic blood and makes of them the dominant race. Right? The Führer is your new Messiah, and here you have this in writing. This wasn't something they meant figuratively. They meant this literally. Right? Men are redeemed not by the blood of Christ, but by the purity of their Nordic blood. Immortality does not belong to the soul, but derives from the race. So there's nothing left of Christianity at this point, right? This is a complete and utter redefinition of what Christianity means. So here are a few more. This guy formally became minister of the church, secretary of the church in Berlin, Hans Karl. A new authority has arisen on what Christ and Christianity really are. And it's Adolf Hitler. Surprise, surprise, right? So the new Messiah gets to redefine what Christianity is. It is from such an estimate of Hitler, then, that the greeting Heil Hitler, which means salvation to or from Hitler, Heil is the German word for salvation, gets its real meaning, right? So you rise your right arm in the air and you shout Heil Hitler, and that is the way it's done. And you're attributing this prophetness or this Christness to the absolute Führer of the whole thing. Totalitarianism is a religion, and therefore it claims a new worship, a new form of worship, and that is what this looks like. So suddenly then, one day in the summer of 33, 1/3 of the Protestant Church, those are the 3 out of 10 who did not go for the German Christians, found itself outside the evangelical German Christian church. Why? Because the church had just redefined what it was, and they were not part of it anymore. And they find themselves in a situation where the new German Protestant church is broadcasting on all channels. Protestants in Germany you're looking for? That's us. Who are they? Right? So a very profound identity problem suddenly shows up, where what you thought you were a part of had been redefined to the point that you're no longer inside that footprint. But it's completely undefined then what you stand for or what your definition of Christianity is. Yeah, that's how you really destroy an organization. So now what, right? Summer of 33. The immediate reaction was that a number of those definitions arose. There were plenty of congregation who wrote their own definitions of what they stood for, right? Everybody on their own. This is the Protestant way of doing things. And there were so many of them indeed that a whole book, and you see the cover on the right-hand side there, was printed of all the confessions of what Christianity meant for those left behind by this move. They printed this in that big book. But it's really, you can say with the wisdom of hindsight that all of these confessions essentially fell by the wayside. They didn't mean a lot. This was a private statement of a given congregation, and it had no standing very much beyond that, right? Nobody was speaking for the Protestant Church as a whole at this point. And then come spring 34, this situation has finally been understood, and it was clear that there was a meaningful joint statement needed from the remaining Protestant church in Germany, those that had not thrown in their lot with the Nazis. And after much preparation, in May 1934, a confessional cross-denominational synod gathers in a suburb of Wuppertal, an industrial city about 30 kilometers away from where I grew up. And the name of that city is Barmen, and you see the Barmen Church, in which this synod happened in 1934 on the right-hand side. If you ever get there, very picturesque marketplace. There's a restaurant downhill. Have a beer, enjoy the moment and the place, right? So 138 delegates meet, and they issue the Barmen Theological Declaration. The Barmen newspaper, which evidently was still independent at the time, remember this is 34, not 38 or 40, and they reported big time. And although this declaration is largely authored by the Reformed theologian of Karl Barth, a Swiss national who was very active in theology at the time, this declaration is really a joint statement of the Lutherans, of the Reformed, and of the Unionized churches in Germany at the time. And it was a very special gathering. All that were there felt that, you know, history was being made there. And that is the headline of this newspaper article. And here are some, here is the cover page of the printed version of the Barmen Declaration. So what makes it special? It is a timeless, somewhat timeless document that defines what church is, what it is not, and how church relates to the state. And it's very short. In fact, you have a printout there of all the 6 theses that this consists of. So they produced this document, and it's somewhat timeless, and it's really today considered one of the main utterances of the Protestant Church after the Reformation time frame. The Protestant Church has not produced a whole lot of documents that are timeless and really make a statement about the self-understanding of the Protestant Church, and this is one of them. It has been a guidance for many churches that are under state tutelage, namely South Africa with the apartheid, and South America have used this to clarify thought. The Presbyterian Church here in the U.S., among a few others, has made this part of their constitution. So you can see there is some significance to this, 80 or almost 100 years after that. So we don't have time to look into all of these 6 theses, so let me just give you the summary here. So the first one says, the one source of revelation is the Word of God. No other possible worldly sources are accepted. Jesus Christ is the only Lord of all aspects of personal life. There is no other authority. The message and order of the church cannot let itself be influenced by the current political convictions. And you can see where this is going, right? This is going to the very foundation of what the German Christians had asserted. Here comes the disputation. These guys disagree on principle grounds, and they put it in writing. The church should not be ruled by a leader, a Führer. There is no hierarchy in the church, no blindly following human orders. The church cannot let itself be subordinated to the state. Likewise, the church has no business in taking on state roles or become a part of the states. And the last one is the mission, word, and spirit cannot be subordinated to the church's self-chosen desires, purposes, and plans. And those are abstractions. The statements themselves, we can't look into all of them, but I pick out 2 here. Number 1, They are led in with Bible verses on the topic to make sure this is all scripture-based, right? Then comes a statement. Jesus Christ, as he is attested to us in Holy Scripture, is the one Word of God, whom we have to hear and whom we have to trust and obey in life and in death. So there's no such thing as a Führer principle and blind obedience of any kind. And then in true Protestant form, there's a rejection of what this is against. We reject the false doctrine that the church could and should recognize as a source of its proclamation beyond and besides the one Word of God, yet other events, powers, historical figures, and truth as God's revelation. And this altogether is thesis number one. And some of you may recognize that this is the format from the Book of Concord, right? You have a statement, we believe this, and we reject that, right? And then comes a biblical reference to say, this is why we do this. So very clearly they are absolutely in the tradition of this Protestant logic, and you can see how powerful this becomes, right? However, these things are densely packed. There is a nice book that I reference at the second page of the Barmen Declaration. If you're really interested in the theological side of this, read this. It's by a Reformed teacher, but he's broad enough to give you the spiel across the denominations. So Nazi had asserted that the history of the German people, contemporary politics and circumstance is a second source of revelation that's at par with the Bible. Right? So suddenly, the fact that Hitler was elected leader takes on divine meaning. God wants us to have this leader, right? He's our friend. He's here to implement God's will, right? And suddenly you elevate this to a significance that it does not have, right? Introducing such additional sources then is really a false God to pray and worship. And this thesis identifies the poison and expels it by saying no can do, right? The second thesis has a short quote from Peter, fear God, honor the emperor. I think in the interest of time, I'm going to skip through that. It is essentially the relationship between church and state. And for now, we can just look at the rejection statements here because it's much clearer what they're trying to steer clear of, right? We reject the false doctrine that beyond its special commission, the state should and could become the sole and total order of human life and so fulfill the vocation of the church as well. So in other words, states cannot expand its own jurisdiction, if you will, to also include what the church's job is. And then equally important, the second one, we reject the false doctrine that beyond its special commission, the church should and could take on the nature, tasks, and dignity which belong to the state and thus become itself an organ of the state, right? So the church is also limited in what it's supposed to do, right? The church can speak to things politics, but as a church, not as a replacement state or take the viewpoint and stance of politicians. But it doesn't mean the church has to stay silent on things politic. It has just to be very mindful of what the boundaries of its tasks are, which is preaching the word. So let me just skip through these here quickly. All right. So what they were up against is some German Christian guidelines. The Church of the Christian people recognizes in the totalitarian claim of the nationalist social state God's call to family, folk, and state. Right? Those were the statements the German Christian had. This thesis 5 is refuting this, and the other one is we saw that before from Mr. Lay here from the Labor Front. So let me go on here. The point of the fifth thesis is the church can speak and act politically only as the church in her hearing of God's word and in no other role. The church has no secondary task. And if church ever thinks it has a secondary task, it's basically leaving the footprint of Christianity. And when you think about it, 14th century, 15th century Catholic Church, they were running Europe, right? They were a power that had the idea that it would be a state, right? They had their own army. The Pope was fighting wars on behalf of, papism, if you will, right? They had their hands in all of the big ruling houses across Europe. The heads of state were all coronated by the Pope, right? Put the crown on the guy's head, he's serving God and the church, right? So this is the same mistake, if you will, that the Roman Catholic Church made at the time of the Reformation, if it ever thinks it has this state-like power. So after Barmen, quickly, this confessional synod and the document you have there is considered the birth hour of the confessing church, because suddenly they have a platform to unite on and to say what they are as opposed to the German Christians. But there were years of sustained and adversarial action from the state. It didn't move the needle on what Nazi was doing to church. It just gave them a little bit of a focal point. Parishes split along the middle. Some people said, we want this Christian, German Christian business, and they split, and pastors got evicted and whatnot. In the aggregate, the Protestant Church as an organization was pretty much paralyzed from 33, 34 forward. They were split, they were not united, they had trouble phrasing what they stood for, and that was what the Nazis wanted. Training pastors then, and that's perhaps from the biography of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, became an illegal business, right? The seminaries were shut down by the state. The churches itself got confiscated, and the gathering places were closed down, and the church basically moved into house churches in many places. In 35, the confessing church itself splits into a group that wants to somehow reconnect to the state church. So even after Barmen, they're still not united, that the church has a certain message that is just contradicting this Nazi business, right? There were enough people in the confessing church that said, oh, this Nazi stuff isn't all that bad. If they could just stop beating up the Jews, we could somehow get an arrangement with them. Totally not getting the point, right? So eventually then the German Christians did disintegrate because they had outlived their usefulness, but it really left the church in a bad state. So the confessing church then was not a host of the resistance against Nazis. They were just another church faction that wanted things done in a different way. And we should not overrate what they contributed to the overthrow of Nazism. Regrettably, it was very, very little. So, come 1933, this is like 6 years into Nazi rule. Much of the leadership of the of the confessing church is incarcerated, and the third, fourth crop of people have moved up to the leadership. And as a force of public contradiction and of public recognizability, the Protestant Church has essentially disappeared from public life. There's no big proclamations or statement that they made beyond, I believe, 38 or so. So they are no longer there. Let's see, what about the Catholics? There's about 20 or so slides left. I'll move quickly. So a third of the a third of the Germans were members of the Roman Catholic Church. They're largely united in belief and policy, and they are hierarchically organized. Their leadership is outside Germany, i.e. out of reach for oppression, right? And they're a tougher nut to crack than the Protestant Church ever was, because they have their idea of who they are, and this is somehow created outside the reach of Nazi influence. So the Nazi hated the Catholic idea from day one because it's transnational by definition, right? They understand each other as a global operation. cooperation in a way that Protestantism rarely does, I'm afraid. So that is that. And they were even more incompatible with this Nazi ideology, as you can imagine, than Protestantism was, right? So the Nazi understood this pretty good, but so did the Catholic Church. They understood this a lot earlier, and they acted a lot more decisively. You know, prior to 1933, Nazi being one party in the parliament that had no, state power just yet, membership was basically used to practically excommunicate Catholics. They were not getting the Lord's Supper. Many dioceses had resolved to not give them Christian burials either. So very clearly the Catholics understood. Of course, this could not continue once Nazi became the dominant force and was providing government. That puts you in a bit of a pickle if you had things like this going on in your diocese, because the people will show up and say, well, what do you want? This is what it is, get used to it, right? So what are the reasons for this drastic measure? So let's see, we have two popes that span Nazi rule. Pope Pius VI, who did most of the early rounds, dies in 39, and he is followed by Pius XII. And interestingly, Pius XII, before he became Pope, served as papal nuncius in Germany. The papal nuncius is a concept where you basically have an in-country representative that speaks with the voice of the Pope. Right? That's a concept that is from the ancient days when information didn't travel this fast and you needed somebody to basically make decisions like he were the Pope himself. And this is this concept of the nuncius, and in this capacity he negotiated a contract with the new regime, history is divided as to this lending credibility to the new Nazi regime early on. But it was negotiated and signed very early, as you can see, in 33. It wasn't all that unusual. Pius VI did 6 other treaties. Among them is the treaty with the Italians that established the Vatican City as the seat of the Holy See, the way we know it today. It's not older than from these treaties in the early 30s. The concordats were generally observed, except for in Germany, where they started, the government in Germany, the state, started breaching this contract almost immediately. It did give the Catholic Church a little breathing room and independence. For example, the Protestant pastors could be drafted into the army any moment. There was no protection. They were citizens like any other. The Catholics in this contract had negotiated that this would not apply to Catholic priests. So you can see there was a little leeway that came out of this. Pope Pius VI also issued in German language, very unusual, I don't think it ever happened again, an encyclica on the situation in Germany. And it was smuggled into Germany. It was read on Passion Sunday from all the pulpits in Germany. And Hitler was infuriated, of course, and he ordered retaliation. So the publishing houses that printed this in quantity were confiscated in short order, and then they started public trials, show trials on Catholic clergy for immorality. And this is, of course, an insult in more than one way to have a trial of a Franciscan monk on immoral behavior, right? I mean, all trumped up charges and big propaganda thing, basically to discredit the church, right? So Goebbels, the propaganda minister, wrote in his diary, after the war, the church question has to be generally solved. There is, namely, an insoluble opposition between the Christian and the heroic German worldview. So Goebbels and other people know absolutely where they wanted to go. There are other entries in Goebbels' diary that basically says, when we're done with the Jews, we'll go after the Catholics. Pretty clear thing there. So throughout the 30s then, Catholic bishops continued to write letters of complaint. They did so privately. It didn't do anything. And there was a long discussion in the Catholic Church whether to go public and basically denounce from the pulpit what they thought about Nazism. And it got never resolved. Confessing Church, by the way, wrote one of those letters as well, similar effect, nothing at all. However, their letter was leaked to the international press because the Olympic Games were going on 36 in Germany, and that had a lot of repression as a consequence. Why did the Catholics not conclude the discussion on whether or not to go public? Here's a happening from 1942, and that is really far along the game, right? The Nazi is firmly in the saddle. The Dutch Bishops' Conference decided to make such a public statement in summer of 42. So July 20, they read this from all the pulpits. Within 6 days, the secret police arrests all the Jewish converts of Catholicism in the Netherlands, right? And it's made pretty clear that this is in direct retaliation for this insurrection from the pulpits. Almost 1,000 people then get deported to Auschwitz within another week. And 3 weeks after you make the statement as a Catholic bishop, 1,000 people or so get gassed in Auschwitz for your insurrection, right? So put yourselves into the shoes of these bishops. You make the public statement, it really doesn't move the needle on anything much. And within 3 weeks, almost 1,000 people get gassed for your transgression. At that cost, will you make more public statements? Will you? No, of course not, right? And that is why a whole lot of these statements were never made. There is a piece of evidence that I couldn't find to substantiate where Pius VI had prepared such a declaration from the Pope's desk. And we know it from his private secretary that after this happening, he threw it into the chimney fire because he said, they're gonna kill thousands of people if I do this. It's not worth it. It would be irresponsible for me as a pope to do this, right? So there you have it. The Catholic Church got molested pretty badly in Germany. Just about every other priest had some sort of a personal restriction applied. They either couldn't travel or they were forbidden to preach or something along those lines. Some 480 of them ended in concentration camps. A fourth of them died in those camps. Other clerics were murdered and executed. These numbers are way higher than anything that the Protestant Church ever saw, including the Confessing Church. There were a few dozen people that were affected from the things in the Confessing Church. The Catholic organization, of course, if you picture Nazi Europe in 42, which expands essentially from the Spanish-French border all the way over to Russia, to the far east side of Poland, if you can picture this, right? Plenty of Catholics there, of course. This is a worldwide organization, right? And they were harassed everywhere, not just in Germany. So, any which way you put it, being a Catholic priest in Nazi Germany was the most dangerous profession you could possibly have, short of being shot at the front. Here are some numbers from concentration camps. This is just the numbers of Dachau on the outskirts of Munich. So of the 2,700 priests that were detained there, 2,580 were Catholic. And that gives you the order of magnitude. They came from all over Europe here, Poland, Germany, France, the whole long list here of countries. You had a pretty good chance of dying. Over 1,000 were killed in Dachau while being incarcerated there. Some 1,200 got liberated when the American forces got to this camp. But it's pretty clear that this was not a good situation for the church. So, in conclusion, Sadly, the corporate action from any Christian churches, be they Catholic or Protestant, never amounted to much. The mechanisms to curtail their functioning as institutions were just too effective to let anything big happen. And I introduced it to the logic from the inside, right? If you do this, people die. Is it worth doing this, right? The moment you have a proposition like this on the table, the game changes, right? You can't just act willy-nilly. There are consequences among your parishioners and among people that have nothing to do with you. So the churches then could also not bring themselves to officially oppose or take an opposing stand to Nazism. That never happened. That said, there were heroic deeds of individuals, and Bonhoeffer is probably the most prominent person that here in the US you know about. There were others, and I give you just one example. There's Paul Schneider, a confessing church pastor you probably never heard about, and a congregation in Dickenscheid, some small village you probably never heard about, right? So in 1937, this is 4 years into the Nazi rule, he starts excommunicating Nazi party members from his church, and his Presbyterian people backed this. Of course, this didn't stand, right? He got locked up, and he was arrested in Buchenwald. Here he is on a German stamp, because the Germans have started to elevate some of these people by mentioning their names again, mostly on stamps and other things. He refused in Buchenwald to salute the swastika. He said and explained to the people there, I cannot salute this criminal symbol. Of course, that got him beatings and other things from the guards. He also refused to do the Hitler greeting, Heil Hitler, explaining that salvation was only available from God and not from a human being. So very clearly this guy knew where he stood on this whole exercise in the sense that we have discussed so far. And he was murdered by lethal injection in Buchenwald, because this whole business of gas chambers and industrialized murder of people had not been invented before 1930. Then you have Catholic people. This is Cardinal von Galen from the German city of Münster. He was one of the few Catholic clergy who from the pulpit basically denounced Nazi practice of euthanizing disabled life or the mentally retarded. In 1939, the practice had started to kill these because they were a burden for the war effort and they were a burden to society, and they got systematically killed. And if you heard my other presentation, this was the practice ground for industrialized murder in the death camps. They started to experiment with gassing people just to make it more quote-unquote efficient. Many in the resistance of July 20 were actually Catholics, including von Stauffenberg, who was one of the leading perpetrators there. Alfred Delp is a member of the Society of Jesus that was the economic advisor of the Kreisauer Kreis. If you ever heard this, this is the big conspiracy group that provided all the potential leaders after Hitler was executed. So they were the political arm, if you will, from the resistance that were thinking about the day after. Okay, we take Hitler out, the regime comes to a stop. We have to provide new leadership. Who are the people? Well, the Kreisauer Kreis had those, and they prepared and they made plans and what have you. Any public action came at a great cost for anybody who got caught doing this. So sadly, the churches as institutions never openly opposed the regime. And that concludes my presentation, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Mick. Thank you.